Hello, everyone. My name is Katy Perry, not the famous singer. That's a different person. So welcome to the first episode of my podcast called Who Run the World, a woman's podcast. Great title. I created this podcast to discuss different aspects of womanhood. I wanted to get really intersectional with it and interview a lot of different perspectives and different people in my life. So for my first episode, I'm talking about gender in general. I'm talking to my friend Ashley Wylde, who is YouTube famous, shout out. She identifies her gender as non-binary and uses she, her, hers pronouns. She's done a lot of really good work in thinking about this issue. She has a really cool YouTube project called The Gender Tag, which I'll link to below. We talk about traditional gender roles, how we both hate these roles, and how we're trying to challenge them. And we talk about gender equality in general and how it's usually labeled as a genderqueer or women's issue when it's absolutely not. It's an issue that everyone should be educated about, interested in, and trying to make changes. So yeah, we have a really great conversation about gender in general. Here we go. Hey, Ashley Wylde.
Hey.
So here we are in the recording studio, surrounded by these ridiculous microphones. It's a little intimidating. So today, I wanted to start off my podcast. It's going to be talking about women's issues and different aspects of being a woman. And I wanted to just do an introduction talking about gender. I thought Ashley Wylde, I thought you would be a great person to talk to about because partly of your experience and how you identify, but mostly because of you do a lot of work and you do a lot of thinking and working about this. The work you've done with the Gender Tag project and talking about gender expression, which we'll get to later. So yeah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Definitely. Super excited to be here. Thank you for having me. Gender is something I definitely enjoy talking about, so I'm excited to have the opportunity to be here today. My name's Ashley Wylde. I'm a fifth-year student, finally graduating this May with a degree in communication studies. I also have a YouTube channel called Ashley's Wild Life, where I make YouTube videos talking about gender, but also vlogs from the travels that I do and other topics I like to talk about, sometimes more centered around women's issues or other things that I find interesting.
Thank you for that. And can I ask, how do you identify? I guess we're talking about gender specifically, but add anything else if you would like to.
Definitely. How do I identify? Well,
loaded question.
I identify my gender as being non-binary. Some other things that work pretty closely with that when I start to talk about some of these things are that I also identify my sexuality as queer. Mm-hmm. I identify as having been assigned female at birth, and the pronouns that I use are she, her, and hers.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to talk about how you identify genderqueer? Is that correct?
I prefer the term non-binary.
Okay, great.
But genderqueer, it's not it's not wrong. Mm-hmm. I just think non-binary is a little bit closer to how I actually feel about my gender.
Great. So do you want to talk about how you identify as non-binary, but you do use traditionally female pronouns? I was wondering about that.
Definitely. I actually have been thinking about this a lot lately. It's a question that a couple of people have asked me, and I didn't have a really great answer up front. So that means I need to do some introspection, which I am a nerd, so I love when I need to do some introspection. But there's two reasons that I use traditionally feminine pronouns, she, her, and hers, even though I identify my gender as non-binary. So the first reason is that I approach my own gender, and this is in no way prescriptive. This is what works for me, not what I think everybody should do. Mm-hmm. But I approach my own gender with, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And since I was assigned female at birth, she, her, and hers pronouns have been used with reference to me since I was born. Mm. And they don't really rub me the wrong way, which is why I haven't changed them. So that's the first reason. And that's true about other aspects of my gender expression as well. I haven't changed them because I don't feel personally that it's important to me to change it specifically, to go through all of the effort of changing it. And the other reason is because in addition to talking about gender and thinking about gender, I talk about a lot of other ideologies, and I've become something of an activist through all of this identity work I've been engaged with.
Yeah.
And feminism is really, really important to me. It's been important to my process. It's important to the people in my life. And it's just a really big part of what I care about and what I put my energy towards. And so retaining the use of she, her, and hers pronouns also functions as an act of solidarity for me. So I want to be able to sort of stand shoulder to shoulder with the women in my life, women identified people in my life, and fight with them and also alongside them.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so cool. Me and Ashley went to Step Up together. Yeah. And when you talked about that, I thought that was like really interesting. And
well, thank you.
But yeah. And so I guess that kind of goes into the, next prompt, I guess, because I identify as a like cis woman, and it's definitely, there's going to be like some pros and some cons to that as well compared to like someone who is like non-binary, and so like it's kind of a broad question, but how does that affect you? Just like walking down the street, applying for jobs, traveling, like all that kind of stuff. Like, do you have anything that stands out, or you hate, or you love, or anything like that?
Yeah. Well, so one thing, love, hate, I don't know, but it's definitely something you have to get used to, is if you present in a way that is physically androgynous, you get stared at. It's just something that you end up having to come to terms with, because you can't really do anything short of stopping your own authentic expression that changes the way other people experience you. So every single day, no matter what I'm doing, no matter where I am, I get stared at. And even in like classrooms that I've been in for an entire semester, there'll still be an occasional day where maybe what I'm wearing catches someone's eye who's never actually looked at me before, and they're like, wait a minute, I actually don't know your gender. What does this mean? So the getting stared at is a huge part of it. It's kind of a bummer, but I also try to take it in stride. You know, it's not really my problem what other people think about how I look. And the other part of it, actually, I went to the 11th annual women's conference here at CSU just last weekend, and I went to a session about women traveling. Specifically, it was about women traveling alone. And I went more to observe, because I recognized, obviously, that women traveling doesn't directly apply to me. But it made me realize that non-binary, for me, it falls under the umbrella of a trans identity. So it made me realize that I experience traveling much more through my trans identity than I do through my assigned female at birth identity. It just comes up a lot more often because I'm visibly different than women, assigned female at birth individuals, and also than people who are presenting as male. I really don't look too much like either, with the lack of facial hair and the thin frame, and I'm very tall, but so it's back and forth kind of. And traveling especially can be really scary, because there are times when you're traveling that you need to be able to rely on the kindness of others. And especially depending on where I am, that can feel like an enormous and unnecessary risk for me.
Oh, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. I think that that's something that's kind of like easy to think about in like women's perspective, like for me, and then as soon as you kind of expand it, it gets a lot more complicated, a lot more gray areas.
Exactly.
But yeah, so because I feel like there's like a stereotype of like empowered women and or like vulnerable women. Like either way, you're probably gonna get like positive like help, and you like don't get that opportunity. You don't get that like advantage. You know,
people are put off more often than anything else.
And so you said you're applying or graduating in May. I was gonna ask about where you're looking for jobs, and is like, just how much do you think about how like your gender identity affects or interferes or whatever with like applying for jobs? Yeah.
At the women's conference, actually, I also went to a session about how to translate your social justice work into a resume that isn't, you know, maybe too threatening to someone who doesn't understand all of the lingo or the jargon. And something interesting that I wrestled with during that session is that I don't know how much it would actually help me to sort of soften the activism that shows up in my resume. Because even if someone has like a pretty easy to understand transferable idea of what it is that I've done with regards to activism, and it's nice and fluffy and they're not put off by how liberal I am, that's all probably going to be changed the second they meet me. And so I'm realizing as I graduate that it's important to me, basically at the risk of all else, that I be able to live an authentic life and express myself in a way that feels comfortable. And obviously, when you're working full time, that extends to my job. So I'm really narrowing my job search to companies that have expressed and demonstrated values of inclusivity and diversity and protections for trans individuals. And I'm considering all of that stuff. I'm interested in staying in Fort Collins. It's definitely crossed my mind. I'm also interested in higher education, and I find the staff and faculty at CSU to be relatively accepting. We do live in a pretty white town, which,
Yeah.
is unfortunate for me. I'd prefer a little bit more racial and ethnic diversity. But I have found acceptance here in my non-binary identity, and I think that's maybe why I'm interested in sticking around.
Yeah, I think with universities and like higher education, it's easier to find places that have these protections because they are having these conversations. But I feel like that is kind of like a nice bubble to stay in.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, do you want to give a quick explanation about the gender tag project that you've done?
Sure. So last June of 2015 is when I released the Gender Tag Project, debuted it, so to speak. And I had been thinking about it for probably almost a year by that time. And how I came to the Gender Tag Project as a concept is that it was kind of the intersection of the fact that I was deeply considering my own gender and also the fact that YouTube has been an outlet for me over the last it's been maybe almost 6 or 7 years now. So I thought that it would be interesting to speak to other people about their experiences with gender. And especially the more that I realize that gendered experiences are so diverse, to the extent that every individual has probably experienced something with regards to gender that I don't know about, I realized that it would be important to collect answers to questions about gender from all kinds of people, from people across intersections of socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, age, obviously gender identity and sexuality, and whether you're trans or cis, and all of those things kind of show up and change the way that each individual experiences gender. So I developed a set of 10 sort of general questions about gender identity and expression, and I made a video answering the questions myself. And then from there, I just kind of released it. And it's actually been amazing to watch it grow into something much bigger than me. To date, there's been over 650 individual video contributions to the Gender Tag Project. They're all compiled in a playlist on my YouTube channel. And they're meant to be a resource, really, for anyone who's looking to learn more about gender. So that's a little overview of what the project is about.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, I watched something last night and I just loved it.
Yeah.
And I haven't made a video yet. I'm hoping to.
Oh, you should.
But I did do it just on a piece of paper, just thinking about all that
Cool.
stuff.
See, and that's the cool thing about it.
Oh, yeah, it's really interesting. Are there any you wanted to any of the specific questions you wanted to discuss? Just for anyone who doesn't know about it, it's how would you self-identify with your gender? What are your pronouns? And then it goes into clothing, body hair, cosmetics, dysphoria and being misgendered, and then roles like children and money and stuff like that. It's so cool. It made me think a lot. I loved it.
Yeah.
But yeah, are there anything that stood out to you when you did it, or has you gotten any responses that stood out for specific questions?
Well, some of the really cool things include how much I've been able to learn about gender. For example, I was able to watch a gender tag video by an individual who identifies as Maverick, which is a gender identity that I had never heard about before.
Interesting.
So even as someone who's non-binary, there was just really a lot for me to learn from these individual video contributions. I've also done a workshop with the gender tag, and one thing I took away from that was that people who are woman identified are really intrigued by the body hair question. I think it comes across to them as something they didn't realize they hadn't considered. Why are you shaving? Is it because you want to? Is that really why? How do you know?
Yeah.
And so those have been some of the more interesting things I've taken away from it. Also, anytime that someone who identifies as cisgender does the gender tag, I find it really fascinating to watch them kind of interact with these realizations that they might happen upon. For example, if they encounter the question about being misgendered, they might have had to learn what the word misgendered means just to answer that question. Yeah. So it's pretty cool to watch people engage with the content and be willing to learn.
Yeah, I think that's great. I really liked some of them who were just so confused about anything that's going on. I never thought about any of this, and I was like, yeah, I'm with you. This is crazy, and it's so cool. The one I was looking at my stuff that I wrote down last night, the one about makeup made me think a lot, because I don't really wear makeup anymore now that I got to college and figured out that it was okay not to, because I don't like it. But then I usually like wear makeup when I'm going out, especially now that I'm 21, we're going out to bars and stuff, and I was like, why do I do that? To fit in, to attract guys? Why? And then I don't know, it's just stuff like that I'm like, well, I thought it was just a small thing, but now the motivations make me second guess like a lot of stuff.
Absolutely. And just with my own experiences with makeup, I also put on a little bit of makeup when I go out to the bars, and I'm wearing like usually a button down and some masculine clothes of some sort. So I even had to ask myself even deeper, like I'm not presenting as feminine. So how is the makeup serving me and why am I making that choice?
Yeah.
But also keeping in mind that just asking why is enough. It's not really necessary that you change your behavior unless that feels right to you. The project itself is more about posing the questions so that you have the opportunity to reflect on them.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I think it's just, it's one of those things that's like, I don't have the answer. I'll come back to it in a few days after I ponder, or a week, or a year, whatever, like who knows. But yeah, and I also was thinking about the misgendered one, and just like how like bathrooms are such like a non-issue for me, or like, I don't have to worry about the sign on the bathroom and stuff like that, and just stuff that is just so like just not on my radar. And like I've just recently, like the last year or so, I've been trying to like advocate for more like just like in public spaces being like, well, where would I go if I like wanted a gender neutral bathroom? Nowhere, or like a mile away. Like it's so frustrating. And like I don't know, just stuff like that is
definitely, that's
brings it up.
Such an important part of the project too, is that many of the questions, if you're entering the situation as someone who does identify as cisgender, then you are sort of forced to acknowledge some places that you might carry power or privilege when you encounter the questions. Just the fact that, most people don't have to think about where they go to the bathroom. That is a really big deal when you actually break it down to its core pieces. And it's something that you wouldn't have occasion to think about if you didn't know a trans person, if you didn't know or understand about trans or non-binary identities, or if you have never been asked that question before.
Yeah. And so I was wondering, did you, when seeing all the responses you got for the gender tag, was it mostly people who were like non-binary, genderqueer? Are those the people who was like the majority of the responses? I was wondering, or is it like kind of half and half? Or I was just curious.
Well, first of all, I have to give a huge shout out to my friend Jenna Ann, who runs a channel called Lesbian Answers. Because one of the really awesome things that happened is right after I started the project, she immediately watched the video, loved the idea, and wanted to demonstrate her support. And so she was actually the first person to post the video.
Nice.
And she has a lot more subscribers than me. So she really helped sort of snowball that in the very beginning. So huge thank you to her. And sort of the response I can offer to the question you're asking is that most of them are my viewers or Jenna's viewers, which means most of them are young people. Most of them are queer identified of some variety. Most of them are either trans or non-binary identities, and most of them are white. And those are things that I've been actively trying to diversify. So by reaching out to individuals and saying, hey, you're a YouTuber and you have these experiences with gender, and they're kind of missing from what I would really like to be a holistic resource. Very much intentional about not trying to make it an exclusive resource for those identities that I mentioned. And so, there are definitely cis people. There are cis men as well as cis women. And there are certainly straight people, although you don't really disclose your sexuality in the video. I just mentioned the queer identified because I happen to know many of the people who have made videos.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately it's still such a small scale project when you look at how many people there are in the world or on YouTube even. And so there's a lot of room for diversity to enter the space, and also just recognizing that that's a goal of mine, to diversify some of the entries.
I had another question you mentioned in your TED Talk, which I also link, about like different gender systems across different cultures. I was really interested in that, and I wondered if you want to touch on that.
Certainly. I'm obviously not a member of any of the cultures that I used as reference points in my TED Talk, so I won't speak at length about them because I don't want to misspeak, especially with regards to Native American cultures and their two-spirit identities. It's something that's really important and sacred in those cultures. And the last thing I want to do is be, someone talking about that outside of the culture.
Yeah.
But I did draw on a couple of examples to help illustrate the fact that gender isn't this perfect, permanent system that we're all born knowing about and understanding. And it's not this rigid, unchanging thing. And one of the main ways that we know that is because it is different across cultures. So I gave the examples of the Machi people in Chile, which are a people who believe that in order to do certain tasks, you have to channel a certain gender. So their entire system of gender, their belief about the way gender works, is hinged upon this idea that you as an individual can and must channel different genders at different times. And when we compare that to the binary system that we have here in the United States, they're not even anything alike. They don't even have the same components. And that's how we know that gender is something that we are constructing together as a culture. So Western culture has constructed and sort of chosen to perpetuate this idea of a binary system of gender. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way or the right way. It's just the one we've been working in. And so drawing attention to that can really liberate people who feel like the binary doesn't serve them.
Yeah, and it's very duh, we should have thought about this, but we don't. I don't, so I think that's really cool. Yeah, and then I was gonna kind of pull from your experience as I don't know how to say, well, my experience as a woman and expectations that are on me, and your experience in how you have some characteristics of being a woman. Does that sound like appropriate phrasing?
I think maybe some feminine characteristics.
There you go. I like that.
Yeah.
But I was going to ask, what kind of expectations do you have, or even that were brought up in the gender tag, like you mentioned shaving's a pretty obvious one, how just in our daily lives kind of thing.
Certainly.
So it ended a little vague, but yeah.
Right. The interesting thing, I think, is that because my gender identity is somewhat ambiguous, because it's non-binary, which is a sort of vague catch-all term, and because my presentation is androgynous, basically incorporating both masculinity and femininity, and so not really falling between them, but more outside them, it really depends on who it is, what their expectations of me are. So someone who has no concept of who I am and views me for the first time, I typically tend to read as male, and I tend to read as a lot younger than I actually am, because a male person who looked like me would probably be developmentally maybe in their late teens. Like I said, I don't have facial hair, that kind of thing. So their expectations of me are whatever the traditional masculine role would be in that setting. And then other times, if someone knows me, or if they just happen to notice that I have more feminine characteristics in my face or in my body, then they'll expect me to portray myself as a queer woman, as taking on the role of rebellious or sort of separate from heterosexual culture, but not really considering the gender aspect. And then there's the people who just don't know what to do with me at all. But one thing that's really cool is that I found that the necessity to carve my own space has also lended me the freedom to tell other people what my expectations of me are. And since they don't really have a strong set of cultural references to pull on about whether or not I should shave, or whether or not I should like working on cars, or what my pronouns should be, they have to kind of take what I say at face value, which is really awesome for me. So if they say, why don't you shave? They're exposing, hey, I had the expectation that you shaved. And then I say, why do you? And then, then they're like, well, where did that even come from? And why am I expecting that you shave? Is it because I perceive you to be a woman? Is it because I'm putting you in a category you don't fit in? And so really using those as teachable moments has been an interesting part of negotiating expectations.
And do you have days where you're just too exhausted and you just decide, I will not be using this as an educational moment today?
Oh, definitely. I have moments, actually, I probably have weeks, sometimes even months, where I'm like, education mode is turned off. I just want you to stop staring at me so I can live my life.
Oh, definitely.
But like I mentioned, you learn to navigate it. At least I have.
Nice. And then I was kind of wondering if you wanted to talk about like your experiences with being misgendered, but kind of like how best to approach this. My approach is kind of like always ask people, their pronouns or how they prefer, but if you had any personal advice on that.
It's definitely a good approach, and I always appreciate it when people ask me my pronouns. But usually that's not the kind of person who's misgendering me anyways. Typically the person who's misgendering me is someone who hasn't had occasion to think much about gender. And when I first experienced being misgender, which was right after I cut my hair shorter, I was pretty angry about it. And the anger wasn't directed at the other person, but I also didn't know what it was directed at. And that's what led me to actually consider my gender a little more critically and try to figure out, where is this anger coming from? If being called he, him, his, sir, mister doesn't feel good to me, what does that say, So since then, I've done a lot of work and thinking, and also, engaging in like workshops and conversations. And one of the things that I try to do, if at all possible, is let it go. Just totally and completely ignore it. So that usually goes one of two ways. Someone says, "Hey, sir," and I say, "Hi, I'd like this, that, and the other thing." And then they say, "Oh, sorry." And I say, "It's okay. Could you also add this?" And I just sort of gloss over it. Or the other is they never correct themselves, which is totally fine with me as well. And it's just let bygones be bygones and I move on. Something interesting that I'm encountering lately is the realization that being referred to as a woman actually also feels misgendering at times, because woman isn't how I identify. And there's this connection that people have in their minds between the pronouns you use and the way you identify. And again, it's not something I can hold others responsible for knowing. It's not something I have any right to be angry with anyone else about. But it is interesting to navigate that of the two options given, both misgender me. And what does that actually mean for me? When is my gender honored? And what does that feel like?
I really like that. Yeah, and then I don't really have a question with this, but I like a thing that I've heard you say in some of your videos, and something that I like am very strong believer is like strict gender roles like hurt everyone. Yeah, and I think that's a good kind of note to like end on, I guess, is just like it's so over, like always changing, and it's so like exclusive, and then we can easily change it to not be so exclusive. And if you just had anything to add about that.
I would just say it's all about frame of mind. And if you can get a clearer understanding of how strict gender roles are hurting you, you can begin to guess how they might be hurting others. And it's a lot easier to stop yourself from policing, because policing is something that we just do naturally. We say, "Hey, these are the rules. Don't you know the rules?" Like if you don't follow the rules, everything will turn into chaos.
Oh, absolutely.
That's how we make sense of the world. It's not an inherently evil way to approach anything, but it does do harm. I think an important exercise is look at a list of traditionally masculine gender roles. Just go down the list. They're fearless, they're emotionless, they're easy to anger, they don't care about family, they care about career, and they're strong, they're providers, and they know how to fix things, and they know how to save you and make it right. And then ask yourself, if you're a man-identified person, how many of these actually apply to me? Or if you just know someone who identifies as a man, how many of these actually apply to them?
Yeah.
Then ask yourself, can I think of anyone who these all apply to? And usually the answer is characters in movies or on TV, but no actual real human beings. And that's how we know people are doing things because they provide social comfort. Things like shaving, even if they don't particularly care. And social comfort is an acceptable and worthy goal. But it might not be your first choice to motivate your behavior. It just might not be something you've thought about before. So I would definitely just reiterate that almost nobody meets every single strict gender role that we have for men and for women.
Absolutely.
And that when you try to, you actually start to erase some of the things that make you you.
Yeah, I think it's not surprising, but it is interesting that when we're talking about gender issues, it's like women and like non-binary people who are interested in gender issues, even though it's like gender equality is like a women's issue, even though it obviously should not be. But yeah, I just had a conversation last week with a couple of my male identifying friends, and they were just talking about like, oh, men are simple, like we just want this and this and this, and I was like, got like a little heated, and I was like, no, like give yourself credit, like this is bad, like strict gender roles are bad, and blah blah. And they were like, Katie, like did you get offended by the fact that we said men were simple? And I was like, you should be offended. I'm not offended. Like, I just got, like, it's interesting, and I think they were okay with it, but yeah, they were very just like, like things to think about, you know.
Definitely. Honestly, to me, it's really sad. It's actually really heartbreaking the way that strict gender roles confine men. Men
Definitely.
are like, obviously, they're perpetuators of violence statistically, which is horrific. But we can also point to the reasons that some of that takes place, like that we have a culture that enforces violence as a gender role upon men, and that men who are not necessarily violent or even strong or even dominant at all feel the need to step into those roles to have their masculinity validated. And I find it to be one of the saddest aspects of gender, that we don't allow men in this culture to be dynamic, emotional, passionate, diverse human beings. We really take that opportunity away from them, and it's upsetting.
Yeah, I'm really passionate about that. Like, and even if you take the benefits for men out of the equation, which you should not, but like then if we made improvements in masculinity and like our ideas about it, then like everyone else is also like not getting the pain that's brought by this like masculinity.
Exactly.
You know, so I'm just like, okay, like for selfish reasons, I also want to improve masculinity so women are hurt less. You know, oh, it's great, but also terrible. That's all of the general prompts, I guess I would say. Do you have anything else you want to touch on?
Not really. I'm excited to continue to see where the Gender Tag Project goes. I'm hopeful to be able to have more opportunities to do it in a workshop setting. That was a really awesome thing to just get, down to the nitty gritty with people about their own experiences with gender. That's really what makes me passionate and motivates me to keep going. And I hope that the YouTube playlist of gender tag videos grows, and I hope that the cultural conversation about gender continues to grow. And I'm going to be over here in my corner doing my thing and hoping that it follows suit.
Definitely. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Ashley. I guess we will be signing out.
Yeah, and thank you, Katie. I super appreciate the opportunity to be here.
No, of course. Thank you so much. Well, bye.
Bye-bye.